open concept. We're going to show all the rest of the sites in here.
Salt Spring Island is a community of 11,000 people in the southern Gulf Islands of British Columbia, just a short ferry ride away from Vancouver or Vancouver Island.
We are in one of the richest postal codes in the country, and yet that coexists with a situation where the homeless rates here per capita are the highest in BC.
Across the country, in rural communities, homeless populations are growing. While the scale of the problem doesn't rival the number in urban centres, in many smaller rural communities with few services, there is a disproportionately large number of people facing homelessness. Rural communities everywhere are experiencing variations of the same issues. On Salt Spring Island, the homeless rate has skyrocketed over the last years. The latest rate of homelessness on a per capita basis is 5 times that of Metro Vancouver. The homeless crisis on Salt Spring stems from an acute housing shortage. Gentrification, the conversion of rental housing to vacation rentals, and a failure of wages to keep pace with rising housing costs means the island faces a growing population of housing insecure people and few resources to address it.
Empathy is a lot easier when you have been there, when you have slept on a park bench, when you've slept in the cold. It's easier. So just try it. Try it for 2 hours. That's my challenge to Salt Spring.
But I've been living between like a campsite and my boat.
Oh, you can get 10 cents per can, so.
The solutions are there, but we need to work together, and part of that is educating folks who've never had, real mental health crises, have never had addiction,
There's probably a good percentage of people who get into real big arguments just because they're hungry.
In this film, you'll meet some of the people who know firsthand what it's like to deal with housing insecurity.
I'm Riley. I was born in Victoria. Lived most of my life in Victoria. I lived with my grandma in Ontario when I was 15 and 16. Before I came here, I was homeless in Victoria for 2 years when I was a teenager. And I think more than the actual experience of being homeless was the experience of being constantly visible as a homeless person. I feel like being constantly perceived in public as a homeless person was fucking exhausting. It's the same as, I love hanging out in the park, but it's the feeling of being perceived and viewed and judged that I find deeply unpleasant. We don't want to be there. We would rather be in a different place, a private place. A lot of the people who live in houses, beat their wives, are alcoholics, smoke crack, are shitty people, but they get to do it in private and we don't see it. But when we have some of our shittiest moments, we have to do it in public, which makes it worse.
My name is Spirit Euphoria Nicholas Gates, and I've lived on Salt Spring homelessly and on and off since I was about 16 years old. I've slept probably just about everywhere there is to sleep on the island. One of my oldest camps is still standing 20 feet away in the background. My experience being homeless on Salt Spring was nonetheless a lot better than it would have been in any city. Growing up here, there's a sense of community and trust between people that you don't get anywhere else, and you can take that for granted unless you've left the island for a while and seen it firsthand. This is certainly the safest place for a homeless person to be, but with very little resources for the homeless people themselves.
My name's David Krishnarik, aka Beach Dave. I'm from North Burnaby, Vancouver. I grew up with my grandparents who raised me, my mom's on my mom's side. Well, I found shelter with my one vessel that I came here with, but then the weather started changing to cold, from warm to cold, and I haven't really been prepared. I've never lived on a boat before, especially for a full year. And when it got into the fall time, there's a lot of condensation, and then it makes mold on the boat. A lot of challenges with trying to figure out how to beat the condensation on having a wet sleeping bag every night. Found that I went to land for a little bit and stayed just in a campsite. We had found a little campsite that we created, and we call it Camp Us. and a couple other guys that are don't have a place to stay either. We're staying there too. So we're kind of like a little kind of community. We have our little cook stove and we have our little everything like as a team. Somebody brings the spaghetti sauce and somebody else brings the spaghetti, but between the three of us we were getting by with looking out for each other. And then I stay on the boat a couple days a week when I was feeling like being out in the water.
My name's Adam Joseph Lozier. I was born in London, Ontario and raised in that area. The community essentially saved my life. I came here, I didn't have a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. I was starting fresh. I mean, at one point, a lot of us have had the world by the short and curlies, and through no fault of our own sometimes, mitigating factors and extenuating circumstances, you find yourself in a position where you have nothing and you have to start anew. Rural living, having places, transportation, weather, all these different factors come into play.
I go by Nico, but my name is Nicole. I've been in BC for 25 years. It might not have been Salt Spring, but you know, I think I deserve to be somewhere. But this is happening everywhere. It's all over Canada, it's just not here. Like, how is anyone supposed to know where to go or where to be able to afford to be alive?
My name is Toto Andre. A little bit about me. Born in Nairobi, Kenya. Grew up in Fort McMurray, and I came from Calgary. I got a crash course on the housing situation here on Salt Spring, which though is a macro micro thing. It's happening everywhere. It's very heightened here. There are a lot of people who are housing insecure on this island, heightened by high prices, and then you have awkward situations, people just trying to make it work, buffered against weird regulations that don't enable that to happen, that work against it. The structures that are in place right now, and it probably is very endemic across the country, is just unaffordable. Unaffordable housing, lack of space and room, and that's only getting worse.
Mental health and addictions issues go hand in hand. The lack of housing or shelter weighs heavily on people's ability to cope with mental illnesses and recover from addictions.
Anything that traumatizes us that we experience repeatedly is going to become a big trigger for us. So for a lot of folks who've been homeless for a long time, they're continually re-traumatized as they're displaced. On average, somebody who's spent a significant amount of time on the street has gone through trauma that is almost unfathomable. The consistency with which the stories of childhood and then of things people experience on the street or with abusive partners is harrowing. And it is totally normal in that situation to self-medicate. It's just what people do. It's a way for you to take control a little bit of how you feel. Trauma and then the inability to form trusting social connections because of trauma is the primary driver of addiction.
Mental health brings people sometimes to a place where they can't get back on their feet, and you just end up there. To not even feel safe to have a home or a community can really be scary for people. So maybe to turn to something that takes those thoughts away or takes the pain away is why people end up where they end up. And if anyone could just remember that, we all should have more compassion for others, so we don't know what they've been through.
The availability of housing or shelter is a major determinant of health. Provision of shelter and housing is a first step in the road to recovery for many.
What we see with people that do have mental health challenges and substance use issues is when they have stable housing they're able to access supports and they're better able to have positive outcomes. And we see a vast improvement in their life overall. As long as they have the support and they have a roof over their head, they do a lot better.
When mental health and addiction issues are paired with homelessness in a community with sparse resources to respond, people can often be left out on their own to manage an unmanageable situation. On Salt Spring Island, as in many other rural places, the few resources available are in much higher demand.
And in terms of homelessness, where mental health and substance use is pretty common, and that's part of the whole kind of formula, we, as many other rural communities, are seriously underserved. We don't have any specialized services. It's so narrow that there's a team through our health authority that can provide kind of a generic response, but none of the specialized services that would probably be required if you had a fully fleshed out continuum of services here.
I value the work that Island Health is providing. Definitely they have capacity. They require a lot of, they have a high demand for their services, and so there are some challenges there in terms of accessing the supports, but the people that we work with, social workers, forensic nurse examiners at the hospital, and the mental health substance use team, there definitely is a real spirit of collaboration, which is positive.
It's like a perfect storm. So when you say there's not enough shelter, there definitely is not enough mental health resources here. We don't have the capacity to respond. Addiction services, we don't have supportive recovery. We don't have detox. We don't have those kinds of services here. Our policing level that help to kind of organize our community a little bit and can be supportive. We're understaffed in that particular way. Our hospital is not prepared for homeless people with chronic health conditions, and so when you add all those up, we are just behind the eight ball because they accumulate to be very weak safety net in the community in general.
On Salt Spring, the government-funded services that are available through programs designed to serve the homeless population can be traced to just a couple of service providers.
Our organization has been around since 1992. And we operate on Salt Spring Island and provide services to the Southern Gulf Islands area. We are an organization that primarily works towards anti-violence services for women and children who are experiencing violence and abuse. So this looks like outreach, counseling services, transitional housing, additional referrals and access to support services with our partner agencies.
Our services have been around for 45 years, and Salt Spring Community Services is a key resource for the community and for all sorts of people in the community. We have services for all populations, from early childhood to family and teens and adults and seniors. Our organization has been involved in pretty specific ways with the homeless and insecure housed for the last 15 years. Our strategy to get involved and be a better resource for the homeless followed numerous paths. When it became really apparent about 15 years ago that this was a really growing to be a community priority, with the rising numbers of people that are housing insecure, our services just got bigger and bigger. So our housing, our shelter, and our food programs have just tripled and quadrupled over the last number of years.
I work at the shelter. I worked at the shelter for like 2 or 3 years in various manifestations of the shelter. Like, it's been very different. We've moved buildings. We've changed our program delivery a lot. It's kind of like the only show in town. Like, community services has lots of different programs. They have a lot of food programs. They have programs for adults with disabilities. They have programs for seniors. But yeah, the program that I work in deals with adult homelessness specifically. And I think that it's great. Like, I think that it's really good. We have a lot of folks who come through from other places like Duncan or Victoria or Vancouver, and they're like, this is like really cool. Like, this is the coolest shelter I've ever seen. But it's also very Salt Spring. The first year I worked there, we closed in April, and we would do dinner, like community dinner, and then we would open up at 7. So we were pretty much open from 7 at night, and then we would kick folks out at like 8 or 9 a.m., I think. And then the next year we were open all year round, but we were still closed during the daytime. And then we ended up buying the building that was behind the small little shelter. So the shelter used to take place in this like 1-story, like it was really little. Like it was very, very small. We had like 1 bathroom, 1 shower, little tiny office, and then bunk beds, like dorm style bunk beds. And our capacity was probably about 20 people. So then we bought the building behind that, and our capacity there is about 30, but it's a lot bigger. We have 3 bathrooms, like 2 floors. We have like a kitchen, like an actual kitchen. We didn't have that before. We just had a microwave and like a hot plate kind of thing. So yeah, we pretty much went from being an emergency cold weather winter shelter to being 24/7 year round, just open all of the time, except for 2 hours a day where we clean. We're low barrier, and specifically because we're the only shelter on Salt Spring other than the transition house, we have to be low barrier. So we accept pets, we accept couples, we accept folks who are like using, folks who come home drunk. Like the rules are just like, please don't use your drugs on the property, and please don't like drink beer on the property. But if you're high or drunk, you can like come home, absolutely. So we're super low barrier in that way. But we don't have the wraparound supports that the city would have. Like we don't have an ACT team, we don't have a psychiatrist, we don't have, pretty much we can call the cops or an ambulance. And then also sometimes they won't even come because we're staffed and they're short-staffed.
The model of housing first is to provide housing and supports. But part of the nature of the housing stock in rural communities is a clear and definite limit to availability. Smaller communities face unique difficulties in creating more housing.
Still maintain that housing first model, which is simply housing plus supports. You can't have one without the other. They both have to work in tandem, becomes fundamental to everything that we do.
We help people obtain and retain housing. We also believe the philosophy of that program is that everyone has a right to housing. So people do not need to be ready for housing. Once their housing is stable, they then can work on their mental health and any substance use issues they may have. So what I have to say about housing first is that it has been extremely challenging here on the island right now to find housing for people. A lot of homelessness right now, as well as people living in a great deal of substandard housing. So what we see with that is people experiencing conditions of, pest infestation, mold, living in RVs without windows and without doors and making do in the cold weather, having no amenities such as water and sewer, groups of people living in chicken coops, for example. So those are situations that exist here on the island, and people pay good rent money for those types of housing because there isn't anything else available. It's either that, they stay, or they are homeless.
Our housing stock here is different than in urban centers. In an urban center, you're typically going to find probably half the housing to be multifamily, and within that multifamily housing, you're going to find single room occupancy and motels and different kind of forms of housing that are affordable. In a lot of rural communities, and certainly on Salt Spring, our housing stock is I think about 80% single family dwellings. So that's just not part of housing disadvantaged people. So we've got a very small, narrow part of our housing stock that's even available. And so within that, we got a very narrow opportunity to find options for people. There simply isn't that many options.
Locally on Salt Spring Island, I think we have seen some growth and successes in terms of other housing projects. Salt Spring Island Community Services with their Salt Spring Commons project, iWave with our Croftonbrook project. There are a couple other projects in the mix. And Some of the new initiatives are really challenged by access to water and sort of local infrastructure, whether it's roads or sewer or water. Those are some of the barriers to new projects coming online in a timely way. So I think one of, maybe it's not a gap, but it's maybe a barrier or a reality in our communities. It takes a really long time to develop housing in this rural environment. In urban centers where there might be city land given, there's infrastructure to connect into hydro and sewer and water in a really easy way. Those aren't considerations that other housing providers or developers are having to take into consideration, but also add into their timeline.
In other instances, it is the unique challenges and the glaring absence of facilities, services, and infrastructure that need to be considered when alternatives and priorities are evaluated. One basic human need, and one that's missing for people experiencing homelessness in smaller communities, is a simple notion of having somewhere to be. Lacking drop-in centers, and with very limited public indoor spaces, those living rough or in substandard shelter face a very challenging circumstance. On Salt Spring, some of those people attempted to create a space to provide the basic necessities of food and shelter in the winter of 2021 to 22. They called it the warming space. Without any officially sanctioned status, the warming space set up in public parks. It was dismantled and moved repeatedly as the group faced bylaw enforcement with zero tolerance for camping in public parks.
Originally as an emergency response to quite extreme weather for Salt Spring on Christmas Day. And that's when everything got snowed over and icy and frozen, and it hit -12, -10.
Yeah, this winter we had here in Salt Spring was out of this world. Especially for we went through the fall time, and it was so many storms. Like my boat got majorly beat up. There was so much going on with like hurricane style winds and all this stuff that was not prepared for. One time I came to shore and I went to get my skiff and come back out, and the whole part of the ocean was frozen. And I thought, okay, I'll stay at the warming space because it was a place where I could stay and be around people and not feel so alone. And especially through New Year's and Christmas really saved me, especially with my mental health. I didn't feel so alone. I didn't feel like I had nobody. I felt like I had family and friends there. And I was warm, so that was good.
Ooh, it gets chilly, and a lot of people don't have anywhere to go during the day sometimes, whether you're involved with community services and are staying at the shelter, which is a great place, might I add. They open up a warming space. I was included in that. Some good friends of mine were involved, and set up a tent, food, shelter, 24/7. You need to warm up. It's cold outside. It's a safe place, a really safe place.
Week one, snowing, setting up, learning. We were supposed to only be there for 1 or 2 days, and then even nature, having frozen our tent poles together, was like, no, you got to stay, and we stayed a week. That was the first iteration of the warming space.
It felt like when we started that it was important enough to continue. This is really a project which started from the ground up with volunteerism. The members of the warming space are the ones who work on it, make sure it's running. There's been a lot of energy and time, but one thing that I've been really impressed by is the initiative that people have shown in making sure this is continuing to happen. And I think it's because people felt on a very deep level that something important was happening. Usually in winter, folks get a little more isolated. The nature of living in a rural or semi-rural community is there aren't many places to go after a certain hour of night. There's the public library, there's the pool, there's businesses, but, a place where you can just be with others. It's brought a lot of interesting things up in terms of what it means to run a project like this on a grassroots level.
The warming space is an awesome little kind of microcosm of like what is possible and some of the struggles that we have to achieving it.
The lack of indoor space for the homeless population and the conditions that are particular to this island community define what the needs really are on the ground.
I feel like the importance of this space is not just the physical needs of warmth, but the needs of social gathering space. The one impression I have of witnessing what's happened with warming spaces, it's been a real healing space for a lot of people. It's definitely affected in a positive way a lot of people's mental health, to have a place to go to, a place where they can let their shoulders down. And because of the sustained amount of time we had, it deepened relationships and allowed for people to support each other.
While smaller communities provide unique challenges that set them apart from urban centers, they also present opportunities if the planning, the programs, and the service delivery are all carried out with the particular community in mind. On Salt Spring Island, with a broad swath of social services carried out by one agency, solutions can sometimes be found by combining service areas.
More opportunities to empower people who are marginalized to do things that they love. That's the healing journey. We have one right now in Burgoyne Bay through community services where you can where you can come work on a farm, you get paid.
And over the years, as an attempt to get more fresh produce available for the food bank, they began gardening at community services, and that's expanded until we ended up having a space here at the Burgoyne Bay Community Farmlands. And so now we've got an acre in production that's being grown to be distributed through the food bank directly, and also goes to the Harvest Kitchen. And the Harvest Kitchen is preparing foods for many different programs within community services. It would be great to see just more participant involvement all around in the food programs. If we had the facilities where people who are underhoused or homeless and don't have access to facilities to do their own cooking, or don't have access to land to grow their own food. And it would be great to start to bring those pieces together, where instead of it's a handout model, it would be great to have that broader participation and the support network to make that happen, so that people can provide for themselves.
Like if we could have a community place where everybody has a place to go if they're cold, that gave me hope. Our meals in the park, like Frank's Burgers, knowing that like if I missed a meal or something, I can go, and every Sunday I can get a meal go to have a burger with Frank in the park, or get a warm bowl of soup from Joe. And now I'm doing my own like Beach Dave raw oysters on the boardwalk. I'm going to do seafood too, so I know other people are going to keep doing that in the future. Like somebody else is going to see us doing that and go, hey, I'm going to do my own little my own little sushi bar or something, or whatever. Like it's going to inspire other people to want to share their foods and their community with their community here.
You know, we need a safe dinghy dock. Like I think that like liveaboards exist, and trying to pretend that they don't exist is not very helpful. I think that the park needs 24-hour bathrooms, maybe showers, that'd be rad. I think that a lot of people live in vans. A lot of people live in vans and trailers, and I think that if we just had a pay-what-you-can trailer park with like facilities.
Personally, what I'd like to see for myself is more resources that get me involved with making some progress towards my future and my goals. I'd like to certainly find a stable housing situation where I can feel secure and safe in that housing, and not feel like in 3 weeks something unbeknownst to me is going to happen that's going to make it so that I can't have a home anymore. You know, I'd like to hold down a home for a few years, and there's not a lot of resources on the island that can ensure that kind of situation.
What I would hope to see as a solution would be definitely more affordable housing stock here on the island. People that are experiencing poverty are definitely challenged, but even the middle income having a great deal of difficulty paying rent. And we have people coming to Housing First looking for subsidies that are in positions on the island and are not unemployed, and they cannot make the ends meet, and they need assistance with their with subsidies, with making their rent, when they're falling behind, and they too are facing homelessness.
British Columbia has the smallest proportion of people living in rural areas of any province in Canada, which means that homelessness programs are largely focused on urban-centered conditions. Having identified some of the ways forward, the question becomes, how do we get there from here?
One of the starting points, I think, for working with other partners, particularly partners off island, and looking at provincial resources and regional resources, is coming up with a common understanding about what the need is. And I think there's a fundamental difference and starting point where sometimes homelessness in a rural community just looks very different than in an urban center, and that creates already a kind of a starting point of maybe misunderstanding. The downtown east side or Pandora Street in Victoria are almost like the poster description of and everyone's vision of what homelessness looks like. And that's a starting point, and those particular communities are really it's a desperate situation, and it really is visceral when people kind of experience that. And when you come to our community, you don't see that. The population of homeless in our community is dispersed in many different ways across the community, in lots of hidden or obscure places, in vehicles and boats and derelict buildings, and buildings on big properties or acreages where people are camped out, and so it's not quite as apparent. Most of the broader planning in our region and in our province happens outside of our community. The general directions and resources and strategies to deal with homelessness in BC happens outside and beyond Salt Spring Island or other, and I think also other rural communities. So we have a model to follow and to rely on that is predominantly urban-based and a centralized model. As the greater system is presenting solutions, as these are urban-based solutions, even when they do become available to us in smaller communities, and in our community, they don't necessarily fit. And this gets back to planning with a small community rural focus. We don't have the critical mass of people with psychiatric issues and addictions issues to rationalize large-scale programs. So we need to do it in different kinds of ways. The way we get organized to do that is to find local solutions in very small doses, different kinds of ways to address those small issues, rather than kind of ignoring those because, well, we don't have enough. We don't have enough people with very complex psychiatric issues to come up with a big-scale psychiatric program, so we'll just leave it. We still have those people in the community, and we need to find different ways.
Let's use the incredible ingenuity we have with all these diverse community members, such different perspectives. I think of each perspective as like a snapshot. And if you put everybody's perspective in the community into one picture, that's the mosaic that's actually us. And I think from there we can navigate all of this.
So I quiet down, listen to my heart. I make a whole out of all the parts. I find myself in everyone I see.